Hello, I'm Larry Cecil, and I'd like to talk to you today about incorporating veneer and marquetry into your woodworking. It's a way to take your woodworking to another level and to add an artistic touch to a lot of the work that you do. These are a couple of jewelry boxes that are made from with a marquetry image in it, out of spalted maple with some maple top with the marquetry image put into it. And if this looks difficult, I'd like to show you my granddaughter Karina, who did these marquetry images when she was 9 years old. So here's a picture of Karina learning how to cut veneer with a veneer saw. And there she is doing some scroll saw work, actually scrolling out the marquetry patterns. Here she is after she's completed the marquetry skins, and you can kind of see she's learning to sand, and you can see the boxes as they're kind of in progress being built. Grandpa did a lot of the woodworking, but she did all of the marquetry. So if Karina can do it, and she's a very smart girl, but if you're a woodworker with any amount of time in the craft, you should not be afraid to try marquetry. But you may say, well, I'm not an artist, I don't know how to draw, so where do you get marquetry images? Well, they can come from anywhere. I did a project a while back where I needed a picture of a bird in flight, and so I did a Google image search for a bird in flight. I found a bird, printed him out, took some tracing paper, traced over the bird, and you can see the drawing in the center actually became the cartoon for the marquetry image, and the result is on the right. And this little bird was incorporated into a headboard that I helped my son build a few years ago. This is actually the footboard, and you can see the four panels with a tree on the right and a little bird waiting for his partner to fly in. Another great way to get marquetry images is to take them directly from nature itself. I have some vines growing outside my house, and I wanted to incorporate them into a rocking chair I was building, and so I grabbed a few leaves and put them on my scanner and scanned them in. Played with different scalings and sizes and came up with this image, basically using the scanned images I had before. I just sort of made multiple copies of them and laid them out in different positions, and then created the little vine you see there. I just made that up, and the result turned out pretty decent. So here is the marquetry incorporated into the rocking chair. So you don't have to be an artist, you don't have to be able to draw to do this. Here's another example of the rose table I showed you earlier. I had a rose, but I wasn't sure how big the rose should be, and so I created a bunch of roses on a single piece of paper, all scaled a little bit differently, and I cut them out as individuals, and I laid them around the table, and I found something that was simply pleasing to my eye. So it's a whole new world if you're a woodworker and you get into veneer. There are veneers available that you simply can't find as normal wood. Here's some beautiful, highly figured veneers: camphor burl, some mahogany crotch, walnut burl, redwood burl. You'd never find this in solid lumber, and if you did, it would be very, very expensive. You can also find many of the common American hardwoods like walnut and oak and maple and that sort of thing, and included in here I've shown some bubinga, some coco bolo, and here's some cherry and poplar I received for a project a while back, and you can see the length you can get it in. So this is a typical length you would get some veneers in. American hardwoods you can always get in these lengths, and if you needed to make yourself a 4x8 sheet of plywood, in theory you could do it. Veneer is typically about a 42nd of an inch thick. It's available in almost any species. Most of my veneer I purchase from certainlywood.com, and I've also purchased veneer from Joe Woodworker. They're both great sources, very helpful, very knowledgeable. Chances are you've really won't need a whole lot of tools if you want to work with veneer. Maybe if you want to get into marquetry, it's really nice to have a scroll saw. The other essential tool you'll need is a veneer saw. These are not very expensive and available from a number of sources online. As you get into marquetry, there's a number of other more specialized tools that are available that you can find from different specialty online sellers. This is an image of some tools that are available from Paul Schurch's website. Paul is actually the person I've learned this technique from. He's a woodworker in California who teaches marquetry and veneer work, and I learned this from him at the Marquetry School of Woodworking in Indiana. A really nice thing to have if you're going to do any amount of veneer work is a vacuum press. The vacuum press basically has two major components. One is a vacuum pump, and the other one is a vacuum bag. And there's a hose connecting the vacuum pump to the vacuum bag. The white panel you see there is actually melamine, and it's called a platen, and it's their saw curves are in there in a very particular way to allow the air to be drawn out of the bag. And once you remove all of the air from the bag, the atmospheric pressure bears down on the work. Depending on where you're at, whether you're at sea level, it's about 2,000 pounds per square foot. If you're up in Aspen in the Rockies or something, it would be quite a bit less than that, but it will give a perfectly uniform pressure to the objects you're pressing. The other thing that happens in a vacuum press is air is drawn out of the cells in the surface structure of the wood, and glue gets sucked into these cells. So it really does an excellent job of incorporating the glue itself into the wood that's being bonded. As far as substrates or what you can glue veneer onto, pretty much anything. I use a lot of MDF in my work. I've used plywood. I have veneered on top of solid wood. This happens to be some bentwood laminations. This is white oak. These are white oak bentwood laminations. The laminations are about 1/8 of an inch thick, but the very top layer and the two marquetry images you see here are 1/42 of an inch thick, and I just glued them all up at once and put them into the form, and the results are what you see. Another neat thing about marquetry and veneer is you're not necessarily stuck only working with a flat surface. You can do curves. This is a vacuum form that I made for a specific little box I was making, a treasure box, and I'm using bendable plywood to build up a plywood, a curved type plywood top for this project. And so here you can see the top going into the form in the vacuum bag, and on the right you can see the result of that. This is the top, and this is what the thing looks like when it's a finished project. I veneered this top with fiddleback anagray, which is the veneer you see there, and then the box itself is made out of solid bubinga. But most of my projects I do in MDF for a couple of reasons. It's cheap, it's dead flat, it has excellent glue adhesion, and for large projects you can purchase lightweight MDF. It's scarce, it's hard to find, but it is available. As far as glue goes, I pretty much use exclusively urea formaldehyde glue for both veneer work and for marquetry, as well as my bentwood laminations. It's an excellent glue. It forms a dead rigid glue line. So if you're gluing up a glue lamp, for example, you will get no spring back at all if you use urea formaldehyde glue. So it's great for that. It's excellent for veneer and marquetry. It has a very long open time. The warmer it is, the quicker it cures. It's kind of hard to find, and it's not cheap, but you don't use a ton of it either. I use the Unibond 800 product, which is a two-part glue that comes with the glue and a catalyst. You mix the two together, and then you've got about a half hour, 45 minutes of open time, which is much, much longer than what you would have if you were working with, say, white glue or yellow glue. Drives me crazy when I see woodworking shows on television and they use contact adhesive for veneer. There's lots of reasons why not to do this. The first and most important one I haven't even put here, and that's that contact adhesive is meant for a laminate, a plastic laminate surface. It's not really designed for wood. Yeah, it works, but it's not something that you would want to build a legacy project out of, because it tends to form bubbles on the surface. It will soften in the presence of heat or alcohol, and many finishing solvents can penetrate the veneer and weaken the adhesive. It's totally impossible to reposition the veneer after you make contact with it, and it only creates a surface bond. It doesn't penetrate the wood fibers. Veneer tape is another specialty item that you'll use lots of as you do veneer work in marquetry. It's a paper tape that has a animal hide glue backing that's activated by moisture. As it dries, it tends to shrink and pull the edges even tighter together, and you actually glue and press the veneer with the tape on it, and then after the object comes out of the press, you physically remove the tape, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, how that's done. I use tons of blue tape in the shop. Why not masking tape? Well, masking tape has a rubber-based adhesive that you can't leave on the surface very long, or else you're going to risk that the adhesive will transfer. You may not get the tape off. Blue tape, on the other hand, is an acrylic. It has a longer masking time. The adhesive doesn't transfer, and you can get it in different degrees of stickiness. So I tend to use the tape that's sort of in the middle of the stickiness spectrum, if you will. So let's talk about a marquetry project and how the basic project goes together. So here's a virtual project. Here's a cartoon of a rose. This happens to be one of the roses from the rose table I showed earlier. And let's imagine that we're going to try to place this rose in a camphor burl background. And maybe we're going to use cherry for the flower petals and poplar for the leaves, because poplar's got a natural green cast to it, and maybe walnut for the stem. So the cartoon, the first thing I do is I take the cartoon and I mark it up quite a bit. One thing I do is I put little parallel lines on each of the individual components that are going to make up the flower to designate the grain direction I'd like to get. If I don't have parallel lines in there, the piece is so small I don't really care about it. Grain direction really does matter, even if you're using a very fine grain wood like cherry, which we'll be using for this guy. It still will make a difference. It's a subtle difference, but it's very noticeable. The dots you see are areas of each individual piece where I intend to do sand shading. We'll talk about sand shading a little bit later. So conceptually, the idea is I'm going to take my cartoon and it's going to go above or on top of the background that I'm going to put the image into, and I'm going to start stacking up the individual components. Here's a piece of cherry for the leaves, and I've got it oriented so it's going to pick up a couple of the petals that have the grain going roughly in that direction. Maybe I'll put another piece of cherry on top of it to pick up the petals that are going in a different direction. Here I'll stick a piece of poplar in there to pick up the leaves, and maybe here's a piece of a walnut that I'll use for the stem. So I make a stack, if you will, and you'll see what I do with that in a second. Here's the actual cartoon for the table I showed at the beginning, and I've got a piece of cardboard that fits that same size cartoon, and I'm going to use spray contact adhesive to glue the paper cartoon to the cardboard backer. And here is my background veneer, and you'll notice that I've put some extra veneer tape in those areas where I know the flowers are going to go in each of these pieces of veneer. And I do that because I'm trying to reinforce that area as much as possible, because the scroll saw does have the potential to chip the veneer, and so the more reinforced it is, the less the chances are that it's going to get chipped. One of the more confusing aspects of this is the piece you're looking at right now. That's actually going to be the top. So the veneer tape goes on the top, and the glue surface, or the glue side, is completely free of veneer tape. So as you get into this, it will make a lot of sense, but at first it can be kind of confusing. So for this round veneer table, I'm actually going to have mirror images of each of the roses. So I'm going to take these two pieces of veneer and I'm going to flip them and make like it as a book match. And on top of that, I've placed all my pieces of veneer for the different flower petals and so forth and so on. This is a little more complicated because each one of these flowers is actually two flowers. So if I have a piece of veneer for grain going in one direction, I've actually got two of them there, and I've got them flipped over so they're back to back. So I've actually reinforced each of these individual little pieces of veneer with veneer tape as well. And if you take a look at any of these, you'll see there's veneer tape on one side and none on the other. And that's because I'm taking these two pieces, and because I'm going to be actually creating these images in this book matched background, I have to have my little flower petals book matched as well. So every piece you see here is following that book match thing. In this particular case, you'll notice that my cartoon image has got a little point where each of the little pizza pie slices meet. So that's very handy to allow me to align that up very precisely on top of the background veneer. And so then the next step is to take the cartoon itself and it's been adhered to cardboard and place it on top of this and nail the whole packet together. I don't have pictures of that particular image, but here's another one where I'm using a pin nailer, and I'm actually got the packet sitting on top of an old woodworker supply catalog to catch the other side of the pin nails, and I'm using a block of wood to keep the pin nailer above the surface. And you can see the result as I shoot the pin nails in. I've got some of it sticking out below the packet and some of it sticking out above the packet. And then the next step is to take these nails, and you don't need a ton of them. You really need just enough to kind of unitize the entire assembly so that you've got almost like a solid piece of wood that will be working inside of the veneer saw, inside of the scroll saw rather. So here is the actual rose table that's prepared now and ready to go and be scroll sawed out. So now the idea is going to be to take each of the little flower petals, each of the leaves, each of the stems, and cut them out on the scroll saw as units and save all the pieces and we're going to put it all back together again and the images will emerge. A little bit about scroll saw cutting. If you're a scroller, you know this stuff, but if you're not, if you don't use the scroll saw a lot, this can be kind of a handy thing to know. When you're taking a piece of work and you're pushing it through the scroll saw, you apply the force in line with the blade, and of course it cuts. But as soon as you take that force and you apply it laterally, the blade can still be running, but because the force is now against the side of the blade, the saw stops cutting, and the saw will sit there and go up and down, but it will not cut anymore. And you can take advantage of that to make very, very sharp turns in your scroll saw work by simply keeping the pressure against the side of the scroll saw blade and rotate the work so that you're putting the pressure along the back of the scroll saw blade until you've got the piece that you're cutting out oriented correctly in the direction that you want the saw blade to cut, and then you simply start putting force against the teeth again. It's harder to explain this than it is to actually show this to you, but Karina, my granddaughter, my 9-year-old, picked it up just fine, and she did an excellent job scrolling out the individual flower petals for these roses that she did for one of her jewelry boxes. And I don't really have much in a way to show you as far as the process of scroll sawing, except to say that you end up with lots and lots and lots of little pieces. And for this rose table, I had so many pieces that I had to take each little piece and put it in the Dixie cup, and then stack all the Dixie cups on top of the corresponding rose. So later on, when I went to put this back together again, I could go to the exact flower, because each rose is going to be slightly different, even though they're really the identical picture. As you cut this out, the human hand is not precise enough, and it's going to be slight variances. So the petal from the rows on the left really has to go in that rows. It won't fit in any other rows. So the next step is, and here's another example of this. Here's an image that we are about to cut out, and the nails are all cinched, and here's the results after it's been cut out. And you can see all the little pieces that have to eventually get put back together, and I'll talk about how we do that in a second. But first I'm going to say a word about sand shading. You recall earlier I showed you the little dots on my pieces. Well, that's where I wanted to apply some sand shading, and sand shading is a technique where you take some just sand. This happens to be aquarium sand, but any kind of good sand will work, and you put it in a burner in a cast iron plate like this, and you heat it up, and you want to get just a little bit of burning or discoloration on the edge. The idea is to create an effect of three-dimensionality, and so these are actually some pieces that we did some sand shading on to create this basket weave pattern, and you can see where the sand shading actually occurs, and it kind of gives you the effect as though this is passing underneath and on top of each of the pieces. So that's kind of an illusion, and so this illusion can be with any kind of a marquetry image. It gives you the sense of depth. So let's talk a little bit about image assembly. The first thing we have to do is we have to take apart the background image and remove the background veneer from the packet. And so we use a pair of dikes. We used to call them dikes. They're just little cutters that happen to work really well for this, to straighten out each of the little pieces or each of the little pin nails, and then we carefully pull them through from the other side and eventually remove the single piece of background veneer. And in this particular image, the act of cutting out the image, we actually cut the background in half. So the first thing we have to do is take a few pieces and piece that background back together again. So there was two pieces of background veneer, one on the right, one on the left, and they're sort of separated by this image of a tree branch. And so the step one was to take this and using blue tape to kind of patch it back together, so we've got a whole image to work with. The next thing that has to happen is then the tape side, or the show side of the veneer, we cover completely with blue tape. And the reason we do that is so that in the next step we can now pick and place each of our cut out pieces of veneer where they belong in the marquetry image. And I use this little dental pick. It's very handy. It's got a very, very sharp point on it, and I can pick up each individual piece and carefully place it where it needs to go, and the blue tape holds the piece in place. And so here's the couple of pieces that the process has been completed for. And then to actually finish this, if you imagine now this is the glue side we're looking at, and you can still see blue tape. If you look on the image of the panel on the right, you can see blue tape on the back of it. Well, that's actually the show side. So what I need to do is I need to now cover this side completely with blue tape. I would cover the entire image, left to right, top to bottom, with blue tape, and then flip it over, remove the blue tape from the veneer tape side very carefully, because I don't want to pull it away. And then once I've removed all that blue tape, then I would go ahead and cover that side completely with veneer tape, with wet veneer tape. And once that's dry, I'd flip it back over again and remove the blue tape from the glue side. It's kind of complicated, but it really makes sense once you actually try to do it. So a typical glue up, and this is kind of the true whether you're with or without marquetry image, it's sort of the same basic idea. You create a packet of a material with a top and a bottom caul. Caul is nothing but a piece of, I usually use melamine if I have it, or else MDF, and I put some plastic barrier on to keep the glue from sticking to the caul. You want to prevent that. So melamine is great because the glue won't stick to it at all. But if you don't have melamine and you use MDF, you got to cover it with something, either packing tape or something like that. So there's a top caul and a bottom caul, and there's a piece of rather thick cloth that goes right between the top caul and the plastic barrier on top of the marquetry skin. And then there's the substrate, and then every time you veneer something, you have to have a front and a back. You have to put veneer on both sides of it. You can't just veneer one side of any substrate, whether it's wood or MDF or plywood. If you only put veneer on one side, it's going to cause the finished product to curve and bend up over time. So you have to balance. You have to have a balancing veneer on both sides of it. So I have my marquetry skin, my backer skin that's going to go on either side of the substrate. I have a plastic barrier, and then finally a bottom caul. So here's an example of a piece of, this happens to be mahogany veneer that I've pieced together, and this is going to become a panel for an entertainment center. And so step one is I take a bunch, and this is going to be a piece you're not going to really see, but this is actually a backing veneer. So I've joined this up, and I actually, kind of took some spare pieces and made a little piece in the corner because I just need the veneer there. Here's my roller that I'm going to use. This is a standard paint roller with some with a rather inexpensive black foam roller on it. Here's my cauls. That piece happens to be a piece of MDF, and I've covered it with plastic, so the glue won't stick to it. And here's the Unibond 800. I've measured out about a 4-to-1 ratio of resin to hardener. The exact ratio isn't super critical, but the more hardener you put in it, the faster it'll harden. And this seems to be about the right ratio. My experience has showed me 4-to-1 seems to work pretty well. The idea is you gradually mix this stuff in. It starts off as a powder. Take a stirring stick and you slowly stir the heck out of it until it gets to be completely incorporated into the glue, and it looks like kind of a thick syrup when you're done with it. And so here I've actually pouring some of this glue on the substrate, and I'm going to use my glue roller to spread this glue around. And what you want to end up with is something that kind of looks like you've painted it with a paintbrush. It's a thin coating of the glue. It doesn't take a ton of it. It just takes enough to get a nice even coat on the substrate. Then I carefully place the veneer on top of the substrate with the glue on it. I don't put any glue on the veneer itself. The veneer only goes on the substrate. And here I'm using some packing tape to temporarily lock the position of the veneer relative to the substrate in place. Here's another picture of it. It's sitting on the bottom caul, and I've kind of taped this other piece of veneer down. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put my top caul on top of that, and then I'm going to use some blue tape to actually lock the cauls and the substrate all in position, so it becomes kind of a unit. And then the entire unit goes inside of the vacuum bag. And here you can see I've got a little cart in my shop that I use to, these things get pretty heavy. You're talking, this is a fairly large piece of veneer I'm working with, and so it tends to get pretty heavy. And so here it is in the vacuum bag, and it's going to be in there overnight. Here's another example of another project, the same basic idea. And then what I do is I put a heating blanket on top of the entire thing, and I put a moving blanket on top of that. And I turn the heating blanket on to its highest setting, and I turn off the lights and I go to bed. And the next morning, if everything worked well, I'll open the vacuum bag up and take out the work. And so here is some of those panels for that bed earlier that I showed you earlier, that after they've been pressed. Before I do much with them, after I just remove them from the presses, I'll stand them up for about an hour like this and let them just kind of sit there and acclimate to the moisture in the air. If there's any moisture left in the glue, it'll kind of flash off at this point. So after about an hour, you're ready to go ahead and level the image and remove the veneer tape. So if you're doing marquetry, leveling is kind of an important part of the whole process, because different pieces of veneer, actually the thickness actually varies slightly. It may only be 1 or 2 thousandths of an inch, but it is enough that you would feel it with your finger if you were to go over it. And so the first step before any of the tape is removed is to take a sanding block and with about 120 grit sandpaper on it, and just sand and sand and sand, and it's going to remove some of the veneer tape, but you're also going to level the surface. And you can kind of see in the picture on the right that a couple of the leaves must have been slightly thicker, because you can actually see all the tape's been removed from those leaves, and you can see the veneer clearly, whereas on either side of it you still see there's still veneer tape on it. So that's the result of getting it leveled. After it's been leveled, then the next step is to actually use water to remove the rest of the veneer tape. This urea formaldehyde glue is impervious to moisture once it's cured, so you can soak this thing all you want in as much water as you want, and it isn't going to hurt it one bit. Here's another picture of me taking a scraper, a paint scraper that I've actually sharpened on some diamond stones to get a very flat, sharp surface. And I very carefully, after the tape's been wetted, use that scraper to gently pry the tape off of the top. Here's the rose table, and after it came out of the press, same basic idea as I've described before. I've got to go ahead and level this, and I've got to remove the tape. The only difference with this guy is it's a circle, not a square, and so you have to make circular calls. But that's really the only major difference. And so here's another picture of it, where I'm in the process of actually using water to remove the residual tape. And here it is after it's been removed. And it's pretty ugly at this point, but a little bit of sanding and finessing of that surface, and maybe a little filling here and there, it'll come out beautiful. So one of the other things I thought I'd talk about really quick is, so now you see I've got this MDF edge. That's not going to make much of a tabletop, right? With this, you can't look at the MDF. You got to have some kind of a solid wood border around it. And so most of the time you're working with squares or rectangles, and so that's a fairly straightforward process to put solid wood around that. So how do we put a solid piece of wood around a circle? How do you put, in this case it's a walnut veneer, so I want to put a solid piece of walnut around the circle. How do you do that? How do you do it so it's absolutely perfect? Well, this is a technique I learned from a gentleman named Scott Grove, who lives on the East Coast, and I also picked this up at the Marquetry School of Woodworking, and it's kind of a trick. Basically involves using specially made guide bushings. In this case, I went to a machine shop, and I actually had a machinist make me up a 1.5 inch diameter guide bushing, and I'm using a 1/2 inch solid carbide router bit, and I make a template of that I use with this technique that's exactly 1/2 inch smaller than what I want the resulting workpiece to be. And so when I made my round table, I made it intentionally larger than I knew it was going to be. I knew I was going to knock off, I don't know, a good 1/2 inch around it in this trimming and fitting process. So so I put the template on top of the workpiece, and then the workpiece goes on top of another piece of MDF that I'm actually going to create another inside template guide that I'll use later to actually trim the solid wood edge. And because of the relationship of the 1.5 inch guide bushing to the 1/2 inch router bit, it's a 3-to-1 relationship. If you look at the bottom, after I trim that inside template guide and use that against my edging, it's going to end up conforming perfectly to the circle I cut out of it. Here's a couple of pictures that hopefully make a little more sense. So here I am actually positioning the circular template on top of the tabletop. And so the first problem I have is, how do I get that exactly positioned over the very center of the table? Well, in this case, it's pretty simple. I took a little laser light and hung it above my workbench, and using that laser light, I was able to first position, and I put some double stick tape on the workpiece first of all, and I stuck it down to the piece of MDF that's going to actually become the outside diameter template, and then I positioned the entire thing underneath the laser light, and then with double stick tape again on top of the template that's a half of an inch smaller, I stuck that onto the veneer and very carefully aligned the whole thing underneath that laser so it's exactly in the center. And then I go ahead and I actually use the template guide to cut it out. So here you can see I've actually just completed it, and I've removed most of the sawdust, but here's the 1.5-inch template with the 1/2-inch router bit, and the result is that I've perfectly trimmed my table to a perfect circle, and I've cut part way through, not all the way, but just part way through that bottom piece of MDF. And I'll take it all apart now, and I'll actually use a jigsaw and a flush trim bit to extract everything but the outside piece, which is gonna, using that same guide bushing and same router bit, I'm going to be actually using that to cut the reciprocal, if you will, of the circle that I cut before. And here you can see I've done that, and I've actually using some clamps, and you can see it fits perfectly. Here's another shot with some, I put each of these on, and I've left some little ears on it so I can clamp the joints together. I use lots of packing tape on this because I don't really want to fuss with worry about glue squeeze out. I put plenty of white glue on there, and the packing tape makes cleanup a breeze. And so I just kind of work my way around the table. Here we go again. Here's another one I'm about to add. It's been trimmed on the end here. And the only tricky thing here is, well, how do you get the angle correct to make this work? And so because this piece is divided up into 10 segments, each one of these angles, before this thing became curved, it was a straight board that I cut at about a 15-degree angle on my chop saw, and now I've got to finesse it or fine tune it. So I'm gonna trim the circular part, put it up against the piece, and then use a marking knife to actually mark exactly where I want that to be. And I'm going to take my disc sander and I'm going to carefully sand it and just make that line disappear, and that's how you get it to fit perfectly. So you repeat that process around and around until you get the whole thing covered with the circle, and then the last step is to go ahead and actually trim the walnut itself into a perfect circle. Now I haven't moved the original template that I put on that was a 1/2 inch smaller. It's still stuck to the front of that. Now I'm taking some veneer tape and I'm going to stick this down to my sacrificial table, and if you notice the router on the right, that actually has another specialty guide bushing I had made that's 3.5 inches in diameter. And so the net will result in a 1-inch thick border that I'm going to end up cutting that walnut at in a perfect circle. And again, notice I still haven't bothered removing the packing tape. I'll just leave it on there. It can help a little bit with chip out as I'm running the router. So yeah, and so here is the result. Needs a little more sanding, needs a little bit more finessing and a little router work to round the edges a bit, but that's the basic idea. So thank you very much. My website is larrycecil.com. If you have any questions, you can email me or call me. My shop is located near Millbrook, Illinois, and I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.